While you will be busy trying to understand the 10 diagrams of Yitwe for the next 2 weeks, it's an attempt to help you to come up with your own diagram of how some of the basic Confucian values are interconnected. So I want very much to urge you to focus your attention on the 10 diagrams for the next couple of weeks. But while you're busy doing that, I would like to introduce a critical issue in the Confucian style of moral reasoning, the idea of filial piety or filial love or filial respect. The Chinese term is xiao. Perhaps one of the most important virtues, least understood and most misconstrued Confucian ideas. But I want to simply give a commonsensical, not necessarily a defense, a commonsensical explanation why we should take this virtue absolutely seriously. And of course, I'm critically aware of the fact it is not something that is very easy to comprehend. I remember a number of years ago in a graduate seminar, I presented a paper on filial piety after I had finished my college degree in a small college in Taiwan. I just took it for granted. It's so self-evident. Filial piety is an important virtue. That is, you have this strong feeling of trying to understand, help, and develop yourself in reference to your filial attachment or even love and respect for your parent. And it was a graduate seminar. After the seminar, there was a visiting professor from Yale, one of the leading authorities in Chinese history, Arthur Wright. He asked to make a short comment. And the comment was this. He said, so far as I'm concerned, the least natural of all human feelings is filial piety. I was totally stunned. He said, for example, I really have this tremendous sense of alienation, even latent hatred toward my parents. So your whole argument that the filial piety is natural is false. I was totally stunned, first-year graduate student with a senior authority in that statement. So from then on, I began to be cautious. Instead of arguing that filial piety is natural, I wanted to underscore the importance of this particular virtue in the Confucian tradition, not simply because it's a different kind of culture, different kind of socialization, but because it addresses a very important dimension of human experience as a whole. To take filial piety seriously, we need to first put the whole question of family as a social unit in perspective. How important is family as a social unit in any style of moral reasoning? Now, the Confucian conception, of course, is the family as the basic unit in society is absolutely crucial, not only for human self-flourishing, but for the stability and prosperity of society at large. If we look at the experience in the United States, according to one survey, which is not very scientific, maybe impressionistic, but very helpful, the survey is related to the question of how values have been transmitted, through what kind of social institution, what kind of channels, mediating cultural institutions that values being transmitted from one generation to the other. The survey identifies 5 important channels. In the 1960s, in descending order of importance, these are the institutions through which values in the United States were transmitted. Family, church, school, peers, learning from your cohorts, and mass media, TV. In other words, the values were transmitted in the United States in the 60s through the family, through church organizations, through schools, through peers, and TVs. In the 1980s, values were transmitted in American society through the family, through school, through peers, through mass media, especially TV, and church gradually dropped. But now in the 1990s, peers and TV, then perhaps family, school, church. And most of the people believe that family, school, church are being marginalized. You learn only from your peers, and you learn from the mass media. The mass media is a reflection of what you want to see. So you basically learn from the commercialized universe, very much dictated by the tastes that you've already cultivated. Now this, of course, is an unstable situation. That's one of the reasons why people become critically aware of the problem of family. Not just family as a basic social unit in terms of stabilization of society, but also the family as a major vehicle through which values are transmitted. Of course, the question is that family is there are many different families. Increasingly, we have many different conceptions of what a family is. This is not the critical issue. The critical issue is whether it's possible for individuals without the intermediary structures of family and other organizations to be able to incorporate the basic values for self-understanding and for social relationship. The Confucian assumption is that you cannot bypass the family to acquire the basic values in society. This is, of course, quite culturally specific. The Buddhists, Christians, Hindus, and other other major social philosophies and religious ideas do not necessarily place family at the center. So this is a basically Confucian option. It doesn't mean that it's universalizable, but it is an option. The assumption is that the family provides the minimum conditions for peace and prosperity. We have the Great Learning, which argues unless families are regulated, the states cannot be governed. If the states are not governed, there's no peace in the world. And the family are regulated precisely because the people in the family take self-cultivation seriously. And filial love, in this sense, is not natural, but it's culturally constructed value based upon the assumption that family stability is absolutely crucial for peace and prosperity. Therefore, the importance of filial piety on the surface is a social function of being able to maintain stability. But another maybe unexamined assumption is that family provides a very richly textured environment for socialization or for personal understanding. Precisely because a family, let's say just a normal family, is a combination of many kinds of human conditions, normally difficult to obtain from any other areas. Especially the family is a combination of age and gender. It's difficult to imagine a family without this trans-temporal sequence. You have generational issues. So generational gap is one of the very important gaps and realistic gaps in human experience. And to be able to bridge that gap is a major training, moral training. And there's also the question of gender. And gender and age are constitutive part of the family, which provide a very richly textured environment for socialization, for personal understanding. That's why the 5 basic human relationships in the Confucian tradition, 3 of them are actually family relationships or familiar relationships. The parent-child, husband and wife, and of course sibling relationships. Normally, in comparative sociological studies, there are 2 very different value orientations in reference to the family. Whether you privilege the relationship between father and child, father and son, or parent and child, or you privilege the relationship between husband and wife. If you privilege the relationship between husband and wife, the situation is one generational. The importance of the gender question, the society is more fluid, and the principle equality is observed, and it's more dynamic. In the Western traditions, especially in the Christian tradition, the husband and wife relationship is considered absolutely crucial. That's why the spouse cannot bear witness against his or her spouse. But in the Confucian tradition, the parent-child relationship is more privileged, and which means more emphasis on continuity in terms of generational continuity, an emphasis on the importance of authority. Some pattern of authority is critical. And it places a great deal of importance on stability. If you look at the overall pattern of Confucian moral reasoning in terms of concentric circles, the family is the first circle that is the major test for your ability to move your sense of the person, your sensitivities, beyond an egoistic notion. To learn to be more than egoistic is a basic training, moral training, and the ground in which that training can be conducted in a long and gradual process is the family. So the family then becomes the first line of defense in terms of sociability, in terms of social stability, but also become the first forum in which the person learns to become more than simply a privatized ego. The privatized ego, from the Confucian point of view, is the most dangerous animal in the human community. It's not difficult for you to imagine that if a person becomes totally isolated in terms of his or her conception of what is rational, what is important, and what is critical, and the person can turn out to be extremely dangerous for social stability. And there are numerous cases around us to know that is a problem. And how to encourage the people, especially the youngsters, to be able to move beyond this egoistic predicament, to link to other human beings, is to try to provide an environment for human flourishing. And the family ought to be the first line of defense for that process. The assumption then, I've noted this before, is to make a virtue out of some necessity. Since we cannot choose our parents, we cannot choose the people who are intimate to us and become the major providers of our survival, of our flourishing. Can we make that biological reality? This is one of the major questions for the Confucians, that biological reality, as a particular condition for human flourishing, in the sense we build a cultural code on the biological reality. Again, it is a specific option for the Confucians. Sharply contrasted, for example, the Buddhist solution. The Buddhist solution is to say, let's cut off this particular primordial tie. Human salvation, human flourishing is based upon our ability to make our desires feel and make all kinds of attachment eventually not binding. So to be a Buddhist in the classical sense is to leave home and to cultivate one's own spirituality. And one of the most difficult and important emotional exercises involved in that process is to cut off our ties with our parents. It was very difficult in traditional societies. It's probably still difficult in modern societies. In other words, without that ability to transcend primordial ties, especially attachment to one's parents, one would never be able to truly become liberated from the Buddhist point of view. Now the Confucians argue another way around. If that attachment is so basic is even dictated by the biological necessity. Is it possible for us to transform it, to use that instrument, to use that constraint as an instrument of self-realization, rather than cut it off and then worry about it mentally and tormented by that memory, but to try to harmonize it, try to transform it from within. It is in this sense the Confucian tradition has been characterized by some anthropologists very early on as a tradition that puts a great deal of emphasis on ancestral veneration. In a sense, I came into being through a very long biological line. I need to be obligated, need to consider duty bound towards that biological line. The sense of relatedness, even in the very basic biological sense, is considered morally significant. But it's important to remember that the ancestral veneration is predicated on two principles. One is the principle of respect. The other is the principle of intimacy. In terms of respect, the older the better. So you have tremendous sense of veneration for not only your deceased parents or grandparents, but even great-parents and great-grandparents. But that sense of respect for, in terms of seniority, of those who actually gave our lives, has to be integrated with another principle. That's the principle of intimacy. It's difficult for me emotionally and even theoretically to link to my great-grandparents because I have no sense of who they are. So the important is for me to be able to relate to those who still can be remembered. So in this sense, that normally in the Confucian family, you only honor 3 generations. The 4th generation, the 5th generation ancestors, you actually don't have to do anything about it. You can remove their tablets. You know, in the Confucian family shrine, you can remove their tablets, burn them, and as if, say, the relationship is no longer there. You remember those people who contributed to your life, and you still have some memory who they are, or at least through storytelling, you have some sense. So these 2 principles, intimacy and respect, will have to be integrated. And there is value, there's a powerful value in this sense of being attached. The meaningfulness of being attached is the notion that we are all interconnected. If you read the 10 diagrams, each one of them tries to show the interconnectedness of the human to the cosmic force, to other human beings, to nature, and interconnectedness of the various kinds of values. And you can say this value, from the Buddhist point of view, which is attachment, now becomes a very powerful value in the Confucian tradition. If the attachment does not become simply an obsession. If it becomes an obsession, you suffer from nepotism. But if that attachment can be harmonized, it can give you tremendous strength for self-development. It is in this sense, there's the argument that filial love, respect, or piety is the root of humanity. The idea of the root has to be understood in 2 senses. One is, if humanity is understood as sensitivity, one of the most basic sensitivity that every human being ought to have is the sensitivity to those who are closest to oneself. So the feeling of attachment to one's parents can be considered as a natural manifestation of human sensitivity. It's the most pronounced, most empowered sense or enhanced sense of sensitivity. But another idea of rootedness or the root is that in the practice of virtues, this may turn out to be the point of departure. In other words, this is the first arena in which we need to worry about in the process of cultivating ourselves. If we fail in this area, all the other areas will be affected. If we are successful in this area, that all the area will be also enhanced. So the root, both in the sense of the most basic of all human feelings. Now, someone would say the least natural of human feelings. When you say the least natural of human feelings, now it's possible because you really don't have that sense of attachment. From the Confucian point of view, even if you make that claim, it is important for you to take into consideration of the centrality of that experience as a point of departure. Don't let it just simply slide. Don't let it simply marginalize to the background. You need to think about it. You need to worry about it. Now, you may say this is a kind of particularism, very much attached to the filial respect, piety, and love for one's parent. And some people joked about it. Some scholars, especially in the political science area, consider this is the reason why East Asians, under the influence of the Confucian idea, developed this strong dependency need. Professor Lu Xunpai, for example, of MIT, has made a lot of Lu Xunpai on the spirit of Chinese politics, arguing that precisely because East Asians, under the Confucian tradition, have been very much attached to their parents, it requires a longer period of time for them to become mature. They cannot become independent. They cannot develop a strong sense of autonomy, of dignity of the person by detaching themselves from the parents. It may be a cost. But the Confucian argument is that this particularism can actually generate a great deal of inner spiritual resources for self-transformation. So the dependency need is considered fine. You don't have to become independent at the age of 17, 16, 17. You can wait until 25 or even 30. But that long delay may give you enough inner strength to further develop yourself. So this is an argument, of course. That's the reason there's a very strong version of that reason is that you cannot disown your parents. You cannot become adversarial to your parents. You can criticize them, to be sure. You cannot disobey them in the sense of cutting off that relationship, absolutely. This is the background of a very intriguing anecdote in the Analects. When Confucius visited the village, people proudly announced this village was noted for uprightness. When a son reported that his father had stolen a sheep and have him committed. And Confucius was extremely unhappy about that situation and said, in our village, uprightness means the son conceals. The term Chinese yin is translated, I think maybe misleadingly, conceals the father and the father conceals the son. Now the word is not conceal. The word actually implies moral obligation. If the father has done something wrongly, it is the moral obligation of the son not to conceal it, to shoulder the same responsibility. So if you observe your father's done something wrong and happily report it to the police and have him arrested, this is from the Confucian point of view not only distasteful, there's something basically wrong with your conception of what is the relationship. Now in the Christian tradition, because the husband and wife relationship is so sacred, even if the wife knows for sure that the husband has committed a crime, the wife is not only not obligated, is legally prevented from bearing witness because that relationship in our society is considered sacred. The same kind of argument. So it's the responsibility of the son to see to it the situation be remedied. We have a classical case, we can call it the Confucian tragedy, the classical case. I alluded to that before. This sage King Sun, whose father was callous and even collaborated with his stepmother and half-brother to murder him, even though he escaped and he knew that he's in a hostile environment. He was in a very abusive family environment. Now, the classical Confucian tragedy that was actually formulated by a student of Mencius. You just say, let's assume the following situation. The sage king Sun appointed the most righteous person to be the minister of justice, Gao Yao, the minister of justice. And then his father, Sun, committed murder. How are you going to deal with the situation? Now, this is Mencius' answer. It's not an answer, but to see the kind of Confucian tragedy. Mencius said, the chief minister is obligated to capture a murderer, even though the murderer turned out to be the father of the sage king, who was actually the emperor of China. So the chief minister would do his best to have this murderer captured. But the question is about Sun himself. He was the sage king, his father committed murder, and he knew that his chief minister, as appointed by him, was impartial, it's going to arrest him. What can he do? Now the mentioned answer, it's not an answer, it's simply to say he will have to resign his position as the king and try to carry his father, escape from this persecution as far as he could. In other words, even in that kind of situation, the father committed a murder, and you turn out to be the sage king of China, and that situation is so tragic, unbearable. You, as a son, you cannot say, because I'm the sage king and my father committed some kind of crime, I disown my father. You cannot do that. And you have to escape with your father. Now, this solution, this is classical Chinese Confucian solution, was very different from other Confucian societies, or societies under the influence of Confucianism. Take the example of Japan. In Japan, the father-son relationship is not defined in terms of blood relationship. That's not the most important one. The most important one is the actual adoption. For example, if someone is adopted as a son and is willing to be adopted, now become, originally his name is Watanabe. Now his name is Yoshida. Now he becomes a son of Yoshida. He severs his relationship with Watanabe, totally. He now becomes a filial son of Yoshida. There was, again, in the 17th century, a classical formulation of the problem by a major Confucian thinker. It's a little bit bloody, but I think gives you a sense of the issue involved. If you are, this is the question for the students, if your father by blood murdered your adopted father as a son, what should you do? Your father by blood murdered your adopted father. In the Chinese case, well, too bad for my adopted father. This is the Japanese Confucian solution. You really have to capture your father's murderer. Unfortunately, it turned out to be your father by blood. And you have to kill him. And then presented his head. This is, of course, in feudal Japan, 17th century, right? And presented his head to the tomb of your adopted father and say, Father, I've already avenged. I have already captured your murderer. It's extremely difficult for the Chinese, for that matter, maybe the Koreans, to understand this. But in Japan, 30%, maybe 40% of people are adopted. Some of the most important company leaders as heads of the family were adopted sons. So the idea of loyalty to the adopted family is Confucian to the core. And yet, the emphasis is not on blood ties. So you have to think, if you want to develop this notion of filial love or filial respect, you have to think in many kinds of contexts. It's not that easy simply to say there's only one version of it. Another misconception, it's a very interesting misconception, is that the Confucian father, often the image of the Confucian father is stern, aloof, very much of a disciplinarian. Mother shows loving care, but the father is distant. But this is against Confucian ideals. Mencius made it a very clear notion that the relationship between the father-son or the parent and child ought to be governed by the principle of affection. To overcome the generational gap is not easy. If the father becomes stern and aloof, the possibility of intimate relationship with the son becomes very difficult. So the Confucian father ought not to be a disciplinarian, should always be loving and caring. How to do that? There's one very important injunction in the Confucian context. You do not instruct your son as a teacher. I'm not obligated, not only not obligated, I'm asked not to be the teacher of my son. The reason is because if I become the teacher imposing some kind of discipline, if you don't understand this, if you don't do that, we flunk you, or something of that nature. And the relationship between the father and son would be strained. That is too much a cost to pay. So the proper ideal of instruction is to ask your friend to be the teacher of your son, and you become the teacher of your friend's son. So the discipline is imposed, the teacher discipline is imposed upon someone else's son, not your own. That's the reason the emphasis is very much on affection. But it's also very powerful in the Confucian moral discourse. It's instruct the sons or children to become, quote, this of course you have to put them, quote, teachers of their parents. This is something very difficult to understand, but it's done time and time again. Very important feature of Confucian learning. In other words, sometimes we have to help our father to understand his role as a father. The children will have to teach the parents to be proper parents, especially when our children are relatively young, teenagers. If they can do that, they would be greatly honored as paradigm of filial love. Not obedience alone. That's not good enough. The reason is because we want our parents to be better. The actual parents often do not exhibit the highest ideals of parenthood. There's always a gap. So how to help our parents to reach their ego ideals through certain kind of gentle persuasion. We cannot challenge them, but subjected them to some kind of rigorous interrogation. The attitude is absolutely crucial, but the gentle attitude that you do it becomes very, very important for the Confucian idea of filial love. Let me use an anecdote to illustrate this. A few years ago, walking down to Harvard Square from a distance, I observed a sign which says, "Fight homelessness, hunger, and abuse." This selling T-shirts of a card over there. But on the front, this is a few years ago, it's called Confucian Paragons of Filial Piety. I was surprised. This is Harvard Square, not in Taipei or anywhere else. And in the back, there's a story of filial piety. The filial piety from the 24 diagrams of filial love in the classical Confucian tradition. This is a statement. I'll simply read it. It's about a Confucian filial son by the name of Yuan Gu. Y-U-A-N-K-U. The story of Yuan Gu. Yuan Gu was famous for his act of remonstrating against his father's unfilial behavior. As the story goes, Yuan Gu's father, being financially pressed, felt he could no longer support his family and his aged father, that's Yuan Gu's grandfather, an old man, too sick to move by himself, and it was a heavy burden upon his son and daughter-in-law. Since he would not die, they decided to dress the grandfather up in his finest robes. So one day, the father and Yuan Gu built a beautiful litter and carried the feeble grandfather to the forest, intending, presumably, to leave him there to die. It's an economic calculation. As they turned to leave, Yuan Gu picked up the litter. His father said, "Why? Since the litter wasn't needed anymore." Yuan Gu replied, "But it will be, that he himself will indeed need the litter someday to bring his father to the forest, when he in turn became old and feeble." Whereupon the grandfather was carried back. This is one story. This story simply shows, do not do to others what you would not want others to do to you, in general. But it also shows that the son, Yuan Gu, who was a teenager at the time, had a better appreciation of what the filial respect really entails. And his father failed to understand it. Remember the whole psychological situation. Yuan Gu was not able to contradict his father, like a real confrontation. So he helped his father to build the litter and went through the motion and carried everything, his feeble grandfather, all the way to his destiny. And yet, all along, he knew that something would have to be done in order to persuade his father. And what he did was a simple act. And his father suddenly realized there's something very basic. Now, filial piety in Japanese mythology, and also linked to Chinese mythology, occurred when very early on in human history, when a person died, you simply threw him in the ditch and forget about it. Some of the traditions still consider that basically proper because of the dead body, corpse, is just materiality. And once a son walked around in ditches and observed the body of his parent being devoured by all these insects and looked extremely ugly, he somehow felt uneasy. We're talking about, in the Neolithic period, right? So he put a little bit of dirt on the body, just a little bit of dirt, covered it. And from the Japanese mythology, that's the beginning of the burial rite. Why you have to bury the dead body of your parent is because you feel uneasy if that body is being simply destroyed. And that burial rite leads to the conception of the mourning ritual. You mourn the dead. And the mourning ritual eventually leads to the idea that our connections with our parents turn out to be a lifelong one. So you serve them when they are alive in the spirit of propriety. You bury them when they die, and you continue to remember them in the spirit of propriety. In other words, the presence of the parent becomes a continuous, meaningful, living reality in terms of your own growing up. You never disown them after they passed away. That's the reason there's a very strong argument, if you only can care for your parents physically, this is the lowest form of filial love and respect. You give them money, you try to buy good food for them. What you need to do is to help them to become better parents. That is considered a much higher value. But eventually, if you can develop yourself, and you become useful for society, and you become an important, responsible person in the society, and people will remember them through you, this is considered highest form of filial piety. Now, the case of Yan Hui, for example, this beloved son of Confucius, he died even before his parents, so considered, physically speaking, extremely unfilial. And yet, because he was honored as a major Confucian thinker, totally devoted to learning, to honor him, by implication, also honored his parents. So even though he died young, he continued to be considered as a filial son. want to also note in conclusion that there's a conflict, a very, very basic conflict between two very powerful Confucian traditions. And I would consider one as highly politicized, under the influence of political power of the Confucian tradition. The other one is very much in the true spirit of Confucian moral reasoning. One tradition can be summarized in terms of the three bounds. The three bounds state that the authority of the father over the son, the ruler over the minister, husband over the wife. This, of course, in traditional Chinese society, or now in East Asian society as a whole, became rules of the game in adjudicating social relationships, in developing certain kind of hierarchical structure of control. This pattern, the three bounds, is predicated on domination and control. The argument is that if the authority of the father is challenged, if the authority of the ruler is challenged, if the authority of the husband is challenged, social instability will be inevitable. To fix these authorities is to maintain peace and prosperity. Many East Asian intellectuals still argue that way. But this, to me, is diametrically opposed. I underscore that, diametrically opposed to the Confucian idea of the five relationships. The five relationships are understood: the feeling of affection between parent and child, the feeling of rightness between ruler and minister, the feeling of sequence or orderliness between older and younger siblings, the feeling of the division of labor, maybe collaborative enterprise between husband and wife, and the feeling of trust between friends. So each of the five relationships is governed by the principle of reciprocity. It's two-way traffic. The father has to be loving, so the son will be filial. The ruler has to be benevolent, so the minister is upright. Husband and wife will have to share the work. We may not like the particular division of labor, but a joint venture collaboration is still valuable. But the three bounds is based upon one-dimensional dominance. So my argument is that if we want to preserve the five relationships in terms of reciprocal relation, we have to reject the three bounds. From the modernistic point of view, the three bounds exhibit authoritarianism, dogmatism, and of course male chauvinism. And they have no persuasive power in a liberal democratic society, and I think no persuasive power in a modern Confucian society. However, ironically, as China was confronted by the power of the West, by the Enlightenment ideas, many Chinese intellectuals turned their critical reflections on the Confucian tradition, very much focusing on the question of the family. Since the 19th century, in China, in Japan, in Korea, family has been the major target of attack. Some Chinese intellectuals, very sophisticated intellectuals, believe that the Confucian idea of the family will have to be totally abandoned, especially the Confucian idea of filial piety or filial respect. They consider that as detrimental to the development of the individual. So many scholars focus their attention on the evil consequences of rituals, especially family rituals. Some Confucian scholars, curiously, Confucian scholars, they identify themselves as Confucians, also became very critical of not only rituals but family. They advocated the thesis that all boundaries in feudal societies of China will have to be destroyed. Boundaries. Family could be considered as a boundary. So the individual has to be liberated from the family. And the community can be considered as a boundary. Divisions between the aged and the young could be considered as a boundary. the gender differentiation could be considered as a boundary. So you have to get rid of all these boundaries. One Confucian thinker, actually, that I admire a great deal, we'll get a chance to study him a little bit later, or at least to mention him, even advocated the thesis that the family is the source of all evils. How un-Confucian could it be for a Confucian to advocate that in the modern context? The idea is that in order to rescue the Confucian project in light of the conflict from the West, we need to destroy all kinds of boundaries, including the boundary of the family. Fighting against familialism, the family ethos, becomes a major modern Confucian mission. Now, that was in the late 19th century, early part of the 20th century. But in the last 5 decades, since the Second World War, the situation drastically changed, especially now in China. You see, if you look at the logic of against familial structures, against rituals, against the feudal past of the Confucian tradition, the Cultural Revolution could be considered, in China, could be considered as a natural outcome. The Cultural Revolution, one of the major missions of the Cultural Revolution was to destroy all the intermediary structures, including the family. So the people would be liberated from the family structures or neighborhood structures, and they became revolutionary workers, and would be able to mobilize their energy for the service of the state. So fighting against the family was a very important feature of the Cultural Revolution, but that led to all kinds of disastrous consequences. So in the last 5 decades, especially in the last 3 decades, we see the re-emergence of the classical Confucian argument about the importance of the family. Family then has a critical role to play in society. Family provides the minimum conditions for peace and prosperity. Family is the training ground for harmonizing relationships across generations and between sexes. Family is the basic structure of human flourishing. And family will endure. If family doesn't endure, the society will never be able to become harmonized, let alone being an environment for human flourishing. Now, even the more recent argument that family ethics is politically significant. In the privacy of what we do in the privacy of our home will turn out to be socially significant and politically meaningful. So we see the return of a kind of argument for family ethic, very much in the spirit of the 5 relationships. And I think virtually all major thinkers rejected the idea of the 3 bonds. It's not the authority of the father over the son, it's mutuality. It's not the authority of the ruler over the minister, mutuality. It's certainly not the authority of the husband over the wife, mutuality there as well.